legal counsel that made an effective case before Judge Douglas, and he acquitted Joseph. And Joseph thanked him and then later blessed him and prophesied some famous things. He said, Judge, you're a good man. You've been a friend to the saints. The day will come that you will aspire to the presidency of the United States. But if you should ever lift your hand against me or the Latter-day Saint people, the Almighty, you will feel the weight of the hand of the Almighty upon you, and you will remember this conversation to your final days. This was the first extradition case, and it did happen just that way when in 1860 when he ran against Lincoln. He was highly favored. Lincoln was a nobody, and Douglas finished fourth in a field of 4. Now, not all the cases turned out well. The one that Elder Oaks and I researched for 10 years, starting when I was a third-year student at University of Chicago Law School, started off harmlessly enough. It was a simple business transaction in 1840, that good year. Joseph and Hiram and 2 others, including the presiding bishop, co-signed as guarantors for a businessman's obligation to buy a steamboat. The one who sold the steamboat was Robert E. Lee, who was then in charge of the river engineers to dredge the Mississippi. With tensions growing over the war with Mexico, Lee was sent east to West Point and to New York Harbor, I should say, and he was told to auction off all of his equipment. So the Mormons bought it. This was to be the first Mormon enterprise. Unfortunately, before the note for $5,000 came due the next spring, the steamboat was sunk, and with it sank the fortunes of Joseph Smith financially. About the same time that note came due, a bankruptcy law was passed, the first bankruptcy law in the history of the world, where a person could go in and voluntarily rid himself of his own debts. And Joseph was amazed, but the lawyer said, it's true, everyone's doing it. All of the people that owe you money are getting discharged, so you need to do this to protect yourself. So Joseph and about 26 others went to Springfield, and they filed in bankruptcy, and all the others were released. Joseph was the only one that was singled out to not receive a discharge in bankruptcy, and the reason was this same obligation. By now, Robert E. Lee is writing letters saying, I'm a little embarrassed. The note wasn't paid. I thought it was well secured. The only one left now is Joseph Smith, who is thought to have the most assets, so hold him back. The one who did that was the U.S. Attorney in Illinois, Justin Butterfield. And I'll tell you something about the second extradition case in just a minute that involved Butterfield and the judge who had jurisdiction over bankruptcy, Judge Pope, who was thought to be the best federal judge in Illinois. That case came up the end of 1842. All through, well, in May of 1842, a fellow named Boggs was shot in Missouri, and Orrin Porter Rockwell was seized and put in jail, and they asked him later if he's the one who shot Boggs, and he said, he's still alive. How could I be the one that shot him? He wouldn't be alive if I had anything to do with it. So writs went out at Boggs' request. John C. Bennett was involved. Joseph was to be arrested and hauled back to Missouri as an accomplice before the fact, and Rockwell being the one who pulled the trigger. That was never proved, but he was in hiding most of that year. And finally, at the end of the year, he and Governor Ford arranged something where he could go before Judge Pope in the second extradition case and be heard. And his lawyer, as I say, was Justin Butterfield. Now, Butterfield was quite an effective advocate, as we'll see. Judge Pope was a good, fair judge. And this was the most notorious case up to then in the history of Illinois. This was the case to send the Mormon prophet back to Missouri, and everyone knew if he went back, he would be killed. So the town turned out for this show. The courtroom was absolutely packed, and so the judge said, I'll invite all the women in the room to come up and sit by me. And so there were chairs up front in this big, beautiful courthouse, and so all the women are up front, including Mary Todd Lincoln. So Butterfield, in his opening remarks, steps forward and addresses Judge Pope in this way. Your Honor, I come before the judge in the presence of these angels to defend the prophet of the Lord, which he did. And that was a very successful case. Not quite as happy was the third attempt at extradition. Boggs was no longer able to do anything. That was decided by Judge Pope. But now they get a re-indictment for those old Missouri charges. And now Governor Ford agrees that Constable Wilson from Carthage can join with Constable Reynolds from Missouri, and they can take care of Joseph in their own way. So they happen to seize Joseph while he's out of his safe harbor in Nauvoo, up visiting family in Dixon in July of 1843. The word came back in a very hurried way that Joseph had been seized and he was being bundled off to Missouri, and he may even be kidnapped and bound and gagged and on the river as they spoke. So they sent the Maid of Iowa up and down the river to stop all the boats and search them to see if he was already on board. And others went by land out scurrying around, but it was Hiram who got the Nauvoo Legion mobilized, and they came out in force. And so what we have here is these two constables who have Joseph in their custody, and the constables are in the custody of the Nauvoo Legion. So the prisoners are prisoners of the prisoners. And they all go marching back to Nauvoo except Joseph and Emma, who get to have a nice carriage ride. And when they reach Nauvoo, he goes to court, and of course the habeas corpus does the usual job, and he is exonerated. So that's the third attempt. But at this point, things are really boiling over. This is July 1843. This is when the word goes out that the Mormons are beyond the law. There is no way that you could ever get Joseph to answer for all his crimes and his past misbehavior, as long as that city charter is protecting them. So now the other side of Joseph's spiritual life, though, was focused primarily on the temple. With all of these other escapades going on in the background and fearing for his own safety and his well-being, he still pressed ahead with all that he had to build the temple. And this was a 5-year process. He did not see it through to conclusion, but his last general conference was the first week in April, 1844. And this is when he preached his monumental King Follett discourse, and had so many spiritual experiences. It was a beautiful, gorgeous spring day. They were out of doors on the banks of the river. The flowers were budding and the birds were singing, and Joseph called this the best and most glorious 5 consecutive days ever enjoyed by this generation. But then later, as he passed the temple on his way to Carthage, he said, "This is the loveliest place and the best people on earth. Little do they know the trials that await them." Well, here are the trials. Just within days, a trio of brothers were excommunicated. Some already were out, actually, and this was the Laws, 2 brothers, the Higbees, who were sons of one of Joseph's dearest friends. Judge Elias Higby was a revered and an honorable man. And then 2 others, the Fosters. And right now, one of the projects I have with the Joseph Smith Papers team is to trace a series of suits that these and other disaffected members brought against Joseph that whole year of 1844. But in April, just after General Conference, they, now being cut off from the church, met and organized their own Reformed church with William Law as the president, and Wilson was a counselor, and the Fosters were apostles, or one of the Higbees, one of the Fosters. The next thing they did was to acquire a printing press. And Francis Higby said, "We'll do this so that we'll cause its own destruction. We want the press destroyed, because the moment they lay a hand on the press," this is his quote, "that will mark the downfall of Joseph Smith and all of Nauvoo." Very prophetic. Now, this was the culmination, as I say, of this series of harassing suits. There were a dozen suits in 1844, all for the purpose of hauling Joseph out of Nauvoo to Carthage, where he could be killed in one way or another. So exactly 1 month to the day before he was killed, he was in Carthage answering some of these suits. There were 2 grand jury indictments, and Francis Higby had 2 other cases going, and 3 other disaffected members you wouldn't even recognize had suits all going against Joseph at the same time. So here he is at this Hamilton house, and we'll get back to that in a minute here. This is the only hotel in town.